I've been casting about in my mind for a frame of reference for my emotional state in the wake of so much of what has happened in the Middle East and in the world in just the last year or so. And it finally dawned on me that the place to look was in a wonderful film, which some of you may have seen, by that great Jewish philosopher Woody Allen. It's a film called Play It Again, Sam. It's one of his films from the 70s. And there's a wonderful moment in the movie when he and Diane Keaton are ambling through I guess it's the Museum of Modern Art, looking at paintings. And Woody spots this dark-haired, exotic-looking brunette on the other side of the gallery, staring intently at a Jackson Pollock painting. So he plucks up his courage, walks up to her, and he says, "That's a lovely Jackson Pollock. What does it say to you?" And she says, "It restates the negativeness of the universe, the hideous, lonely emptiness of existence, nothingness, the predicament of man forced to live in a barren, godless eternity like a tiny flickering flame in an immense void with nothing but waste, horror, and degradation, forming a useless, bleak straitjacket in a black, absurd cosmos." He takes this in, he says, "What are you doing Saturday night?" He says, "I'm committing suicide." He says, "How about Friday night?" So anyway, that's my speech. Thank you. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this year's events. And I think that you often can find, if you spend enough time dwelling on these subjects, you can try to think through the significance of particular events and try to draw some lessons for what they mean to us as Jews, what they mean to us as Americans, and what they mean to us in, I guess, a broader sense as members and participants and believers in what's used to be called Western civilization. And so I want to draw your attention to three events from 2015 in particular. I want to begin by the events that took place in Paris at the very beginning of the year in January. The terrorist attack on the editorial offices of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical French newspaper. And then a day after that, the murder of 4 Jews doing their shopping for Shabbat. That Friday, I think January 6th or 7th. And what happened in the Charlie Hebdo offices seems to me hugely important, seems to me to have a significance that goes well beyond the fact that it was yet another terrorist attack by Islamic fanatics against defenseless civilians. You know, since at least since 2001, probably before that, but certainly since the attacks of September 11th, there has been a debate in the foreign policy circles of the United States, of the West, a debate in which probably all of you at one point or another have participated. And that debate circles around the question, if I can put it crudely, why do they hate us? Why is so much of the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, everywhere in between, including so many Islamic communities in the West, so fanatically opposed to everything that the West stands for, and so intent or so prone to supporting some of the most heinous acts imaginable when carried out against Western targets? And there are two schools of thought, broadly speaking, on this subject. One school of thought, and if you read major metropolitan newspapers that are not the Wall Street Journal, you'll find them in abundance there. One school of thought will say that the reason, fundamentally, is the policy, Western policy in the Middle East or in Islamic countries. This is an argument that says, well, you see, if we hadn't supported the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, we might be in better shape. Or if we hadn't supported the dictatorship of the Shah in Iran, or the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or of Ben Ali in Tunisia, or if we hadn't become involved in the first Gulf War with respect to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq, or if we hadn't invaded Afghanistan in 2001, or invaded Iraq in 2003, or if the United States weren't so pro-Israel, didn't give money to the Israelis, if we had a, quote, more even-handed approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict. If we did these things, so goes the argument, if we changed our policies, we would solve our problem because we would not give all of these people in the Arab lands, in the Islamic world, we would not give them a reason, a motive to hate us. So change the policy, solve the problem. Now, against that view comes the view of people like Bernard Lewis, a number of other people, I guess this view includes me as well, which says, yes, policies can sometimes offer pretexts for hatred, but they're not the root of the problem. They're not the cause of the problem. If you want to understand the hatred that simmers in so much of the Islamic world against the West, you can't really talk about policies. You have to talk about values. You have to talk about values that defend, for instance, the equality of women, that defend, for instance, freedom of conscience and worship, that defend freedom of speech, the ability to, as we journalists like to say, speak truth to power, offend people if necessary. You have to talk about that whole panoply of values, which whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal, a conservative, a socialist or a libertarian, whatever, all those values that define the core of Western freedom and modern Western civilization. Now, I would submit to you, as a first order of business today, that after the attack on Charlie Hebdo, that debate has been settled, or should be settled once and for all. Charlie Hebdo was not espousing the foreign policy of John Bolton, Paul Wolfowitz, and the neoconservatives. Charlie Hebdo was not taking a pro-settlement line in French politics. Charlie Hebdo was a satirical newspaper with a scatological and even somewhat pornographic bent. It merely insisted that as a newspaper in an ostensibly free country, it had a sovereign, absolute right to offend not only the Jews, not only the Christians, not only the rabbis and the priests, but also Mohammed and the mullahs. And for exercising that right, 12 people were shot dead in their chairs one January morning while doing nothing more than figuring out what should go on and what should happen in the paper the next day. So let us for once, finally settle what that debate has been all about. We know what it's about. It's not about what policies you advocate, where you stand in the political divide. It's about who you are as a free man or a free woman in a free society. Now, a day after the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo, we had, of course, the attack on that random deli somewhere, otherwise known as the Hypermarché kosher supermarket in Paris. 4 Jews, not Israelis, simply observing the customs of the Jewish people as citizens of France, get shot by an Islamic fanatic. And what happens? What happens immediately after that? What happens is, our learned voices tell us that this mass murder was really an expression of misdirected but understandable rage at Israel's settlement policy. That is the smart view if you're watching the BBC or reading various other kinds of publications. And it reminds me, when people make this argument, it reminds me of something Leon Wieseltier once said several years ago, more than 10 years ago. which I thought was very wise. He said, when you attempt to explain anti-Semitism by saying that people do things to some group of Jews because of what some other group of Jews is allegedly doing to someone else, you are not explaining anti-Semitism. You are reproducing anti-Semitism. And that is exactly what we saw happening in terms of the high-minded explanation for the murder of 4 Jews in France in January. I think we ought to be mindful that that is what's going on again and again. When you blame Israeli policy, when you blame the murder of Jews for some act of Israeli policy, you are engaging, however unwittingly, you are engaging in a form of anti-Semitism, and people need to be called out on it very, very starkly. Now, there was one additional aspect of the attacks in Paris that I think we ought to be mindful of. This was an attack in the heart. Paris is the heart of Western communities, of European society. But we learned very quickly that at least one of the 2 brothers who attacked the Charlie Hebdo offices, the Kouachi brothers, had been trained at some point in Yemen. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Al-Qaeda outfit that's based in Yemen, very quickly took credit for the attacks. Now, here in the United States, for the past 6 years, we wanted nothing more as a country than to get away from the Middle East. It's so tiresome, it's so nettlesome, it's so complicated. You want to pivot to Asia. You want to do nation building at home. We want to reset relations with Russia. We want to build a new social democracy here in the United States. But you know, Leon Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, you may or may not be interested in the Middle East. You may or may not be interested in who the Houthis are, or who controls the capital of Sana'a, or the port of Aden. You may not be interested in any of that. You may want nothing to do with that. You may want us out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, out of Syria, out of the Middle East in general. But, as to paraphrase Trotsky, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. The Middle East is interested in us. And so to the extent that we try to turn our heads, turn our gaze away from the Middle East, to the extent that we try to remove ourselves physically, politically, strategically, we are not pushing the danger away. We are bringing it that much closer to us. And when you start seeing young men in California taking out knives and killing 4 people, or would-be jihadists in Garland, Texas, trying to shoot up Pamela Geller's group, you understand that this is coming to us. Our memories should not be so short. 14 years was not that long ago. Now, the second major event that I want to discuss is the Iran deal. And we just heard from Congresswoman Lowy, who I think deserves some special commendation for political courage as a Democrat who understands foreign policy, understands what this is all about, and who bucked her party, bucked her president, and voted against a disastrous deal. Now, there's a lot not to like about this deal, and I think most of you are familiar with it. It's not simply that there is no real verification provision, that Iran is self-inspecting its military facilities, that Iran will be able very swiftly to cheat. It's not simply that we are going to get a deal which is going to set off a nuclear arms race in the most volatile and fanatic region in the world, so that soon we're going to be looking at the Middle East, not with Israel on one side and Pakistan on another with nuclear weapons, but with Israel, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, mark my words, Turkey, possibly Egypt, all of them with nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability, each of them at daggers drawn with one another. That is the world we are ambling into by telling ourselves that we've achieved some kind of peace in the Middle East. And by the way, I just want to say tangentially, for those of you who maybe supported the deal or are ambivalent about it, if this deal is such a win for the security of the Middle East, why is it that President Obama tomorrow, when he meets with Prime Minister Netanyahu, is going to be offering Israel $5 billion in arms a year, including F-35s, whose only real purpose for Israel is to stealthily sneak in and bomb Iranian nuclear installations if they have? If this deal is such a win for peace, why are we arming the Saudis to the teeth, or our friends so-called in the United Arab Emirates? We should be saying, we've just solved your nuclear problem. You don't need to have these weapons anymore. How exactly does it confirm that this agreement is leading us to a more peaceful Middle East if we're busy arming all of our allies to the teeth? What does that say? I'm going to leave that to one side. As I said, the problem isn't simply that this deal is unverifiable. It isn't simply that this deal is going to lead to an arms race in the Middle East. The worst thing in this deal is that in 15 years' time, when Iran can enrich as much uranium as it wants, when it is spinning uranium not in 5,000 centrifuges, but in 190,000 centrifuges, which is the self-declared goal of the Iranian government, when there is no possibility of being able to detect in time when Iran decides to take that uranium, enrich it to weapons grade, and install it in a warhead and put it on a missile. At that point, should that future president act, whether it's Chelsea Clinton or Jenna Bush, at that point, should the United States decide to act preemptively to stop Iran, it will be the United States that will be legally in the wrong, because we have just signed an agreement with the Iranians that says they have a solemn right to enrich as much uranium in 15 years' time as they want. Do you know that the United States does not allow South Korea, one of our strongest allies, one of the most robust liberal democracies in all of Asia, we do not allow them to enrich uranium? And yet we're going to give the Iranians a carte blanche to enrich as much as they want. And when the president says, in 10 or 15 years' time, my successor will have all the options that I do, that's not true. It's not true on a whole number of technical levels, but it's not true on legal grounds also. We will be the ones violating the agreement in order to keep Iran from having it on. Now, I want to make one more point, and this touches more on what we're doing here at the Holocaust Museum. It touches also on the fact that tomorrow is the 77th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and that is a question of Iranian anti-Semitism. Back in May, the president gave an interesting interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic. And Goldberg asked the president, he said, well, how are you going to strike a deal with a regime that is as anti-Semitic as the Iranian regime is? The president said, well, yes, they're anti-Semitic, but they're rational. And they use anti-Semitism as a tool, maybe at the margins, when the costs to them are low. And when you hear a president of the United States say something as foolish as that, you kind of want to make sure you drag him to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Give him a short course on what anti-Semitism is. Iran has no borders with Israel. Iran has no territorial dispute with Israel. Iran has a rich history of friendship with the Jewish people going back thousands of years. There were 100,000 Jews in Iran up until 1979. There are about 10,000 Jews left today. Why does Iran spend so much of its money, even when it's under sanctions, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas? Why does Iran court diplomatic isolation by saying Israel must be wiped off the map, and sanctions? Why does it have this beef with Israel? Iran isn't even a Sunni power. It has nothing, or it doesn't have as a religious enmity with all of Israel's enemies on its immediate borders. So why is Iran so cosmically, so fanatically dedicated to the annihilation of the state of Israel, to the destruction of the Jewish people and their homeland? It's because for Iran, anti-Semitism isn't some funny idea that they had at the margins of their theocracy, their political consciousness. Anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is the central organizing principle of what they are about. You know, in 1944, when the Russians were opening a broad front against the Nazis, after Stalingrad, after Kursk, as the Allies were about to invade in Normandy, that is when the Nazis decided to round up the Hungarian Jews, a huge effort, a huge distraction in terms of their military, in terms of their military focus, in terms of their available manpower. Why was that? Because for the Nazis, killing the Jews was the goal. It wasn't some thing on the side they were doing. The whole purpose of the Nazi war machine was to kill as many Jews. And when they felt they were going to lose the war, that's when the killing apparatus actually accelerated. Did not slow down, accelerated. And that's what we fail to understand about the kind of anti-Semitism we are getting now from so much of the Arab world and from the Shiite world, and particularly from the Islamic Republic of Iran. For them, the destruction of Israel is a holy cause. And you have a president here in the United States who doesn't understand that, who thinks that these Iranians are sort of casual bigots who think, oh, the Jews are cheap or something. He doesn't get it. And so he doesn't get that this is not a regime that will allow a question of instrumental rationality to stand in the way of its goal of destroying the state of Israel. Rafsanjani, the former president, who today is spoken of as a moderate, said in 2000, he said, if all of Israel's bombs hit the Muslim world, we will only be damaged. But if one bomb hits Israel, it will be the end of the state. That's an equation worth considering. And he's the moderate in Iran. So these are the things we have to take into account when we're talking about the Iranian nuclear deal. The final point I want to make is what we're now calling the stabbing intifada. I don't know really if it deserves to be called an intifada yet, but that's the moniker that has been attached to it. And it's interesting, in every phase of Palestinian violence against the Jewish people, against the state of Israel, there's always been a defining image. In Munich, in 1972, the gunman on the balcony. When I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, the first part of this century, it was the suicide bomber. And now it's people, now it's Palestinians, often not ostensibly religious Palestinians, not Islamists, but people who are taking out knives and butchering the first Jew they find. A 2-year-old child in the old city, a 13-year-old boy on a bicycle, a 70-year-old woman boarding a bus. These are the people they are murdering. And again, what's so remarkable is when this happens, what does the Secretary of State say? He says, well, this is a reason to redouble our efforts to achieve a durable peace agreement and end the settlements. I'm sorry, I wish the settlements were the problem. I earnestly do. It would be lovely to think, boy, if we simply got rid of every single settlement and had peace for 200 years, why not take it? If a Palestinian state were to come into existence and that Palestinian state would look like Canada, what would be the problem? I wish this conflict, I wish this war were all about 1967. But it's not. It's about 1948. This conflict is not about territory, it's about existence. This conflict is not about whether Jews can live in Judea and Samaria, it's whether Jews can live in Judea, Samaria, Tel Aviv, Haifa, anywhere, Afula, anywhere. And people need to begin to understand that. And this conflict is not going to be solved by Israel repeating the tragic mistake of 2005 and getting out of Gaza and creating a giant terrorist haven there. This conflict is going to be solved when there is a fundamental change in Palestinian political culture that no longer believes that the essence of Palestinian identity is simply to stick a knife in the neck of any Jew that you can find. That's when it's going to be solved. Now, is that going to take 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? I don't know. But we're not going to get any resolution to the conflict until people like John Kerry and other senior foreign ministers, presidents, and so on begin to understand that the onus lies on the Palestinians to change their political culture away from a culture of death and jihad into something that might arguably belong in any kind of community, any kind of civilized community of nations. That's when it's going to change. Not until then. I want to make one final point, I think. And I know that, my standard joke at these events is the only way to succeed when you're speaking at a Jewish event is to be as depressing as humanly possible. So I hope I'm winning you over. But you know what? There's a benefit in clarity. There's a benefit in stripping away your illusions. There's a benefit in saying, we wish we lived in a better world. We wish we lived in a world where Jews would not again and again be targeted for libel, for defamation, for destruction. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world as we have it, and we have to see it clearly. There's a wonderful, I came across a wonderful passage in an unusual book that I wanted to share with you, because I think that it says something that is timeless and that matters for us. There was a German, well-known German post-war cultural critic by the name of Joachim Fest. Joachim Fest was a German Prussian Catholic born in Berlin in 1926, whose father was adamantly anti-Nazi and never bent 1 inch to placate the Nazis, and as a result paid a terrible personal price. I mean, Fest, late in his life, wrote a memoir. It's really an homage to his father. And his father in the 1930s, as things were progressing, 33, 34, 35, the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht, Fest's father, was Catholic, was begging his Jewish friends in Germany to leave, get out. And one after another, these Jewish friends said, okay, the Nazis, they're clowns, they're buffoons, but it's never going to get so bad. It's never going to get so bad. Why? Because Germany, after all, is a state of laws, or Germany is the seat of all culture, or Jews cannot imagine themselves, culturally speaking, in the absence of a Germany that had been their home for generations. And so the father's pleas fall on deaf ears, and you can imagine what befalls Jewish friends who don't take his advice. So the son is recalling these conversations. He says of his father, he says, remembering some of these Jewish friends, my father said to me after the war that in their self-discipline, their quiet civility, and unsentimental brilliance, they had really been the last Prussians. In any case, he'd often encountered his idea of Prussianism among the long-established, often highly educated Berlin Jews more than anywhere else. They had, he once went on to say, only one failing, which became their undoing. Being overwhelmingly governed by their heads, they had, in tolerant Prussia, lost their instinct for danger, which had preserved them through the ages. What I want to leave you with today, in this place, on this occasion, is whatever else you do, don't lose your instinct for danger. Thank you very much.